Hi, welcome to the Elle Russ Show, where I deliver content intended to inspire, educate, and motivate. Engage with me online at elleruss.com and on social media. Enjoy the show. Today I have some wonderful guests I'm so honored to share with you, evolutionary biologists Heather Heing and Bret Weinstein. They wrote an incredible book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life. And they argue that the problem is clear. Our world has become so hypernovel that the pace of change has outstripped our ability to keep up. Humans are an evolutionary phenomenon, and while we are designed to adapt and change, it took hundreds of millions of years for humans to become who we are today. And although we live in a modern world, our brains, our bodies, and social systems are ancient, and they are now perpetually out of sync with the modern world, and it's making us sick, physically, psychologically, socially, and environmentally. And if we don't figure out how to grapple with the problem of accelerating novelty, humans will perish, a victim of its own success. I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
So I really enjoyed your book, which is A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life. I really want to say, I feel like this is a very lovely, interesting take on our evolution as humans, frolicking and exploring new worlds. But also, I think it brought me an appreciation of humanity in a way that I hadn't thought about before, and ignited some really important questions and philosophies and even facts and statistics that I think all bring the reader to really appreciating being human, but while also looking at some serious lessons. And you guys focused on a lot of those. So let's just start off with, what was the inspiration for you to delve into this subject?
Well, we taught for 15 years undergraduates in an extraordinary context where we had very close contact with them. We taught full-time. Students took one class full-time, and that allowed us to know our students in a way college professors generally don't. And as we taught the material that is the toolkit around which the book is built, we found that it transformed many of their lives in the way that it had transformed ours. And indeed, many of them asked us if there wasn't some way that they could take the material in that toolkit and pass it on to friends of theirs who they thought would benefit. That the way things have transpired gave us the opportunity to produce a book that does that job, and we were thrilled to finally be able to bring it into the world.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, we, like I think everyone as young people, we're looking for meaning, and dabbled in a variety of traditions, including scientific traditions and even religious traditions, and found in a Darwinian understanding of the world more than the seeds, but not quite a fully fleshed out worldview and toolkit. And then both of us, through somewhat different routes, but largely through field work and teaching undergraduates, as Bret said, have developed some of the ideas that were out there in the world further. And that's what the book is as you yourself said in the introduction just now. We hoped that it would be both lovely and inspirational and provide a deeper way into understanding who we are.
In the introduction, you make a valid point about sort of knowing about a place. You took sort of swimming in this one area for granted, not knowing the dangers. We see this all the time with the tourists going to Hawaii, getting sucked down a blowhole, or, and maybe this was even part of our issue in the War of Vietnam, right? Taking for granted the people's in-depth knowledge of their terrain. And I think that larger point that we've lost, right? We've lost that knowledge. Perhaps we've lost that respect, that reverence, that we've made, you said, some bad assumptions about nature, that we imagine we can master it and that we're in control of it. And you say the consequences of this bad assumption account for many of our problems today. So I guess let's start there. And maybe that weaves into what you talk about, this us escaping a fundamental law of nature. The jack of all trades is the master of none. So can we, let's jump into that.
Sure. The jack of all trades principle is so universal that it finds application from ecology through economics. And so it is curious that we humans are the most generalist of species, finding ourselves thriving on every continent that can produce plants, and at the same time excelling at what are obviously specialist vocations. And so the question is, how exactly do we defeat this principle of nature? And the answer is we don't. What we do is we work around it. We individually specialize. And as a collective, as a lineage, we get the benefits of generalism. So through division of labor, we get the best of both worlds. The problem is that in order to do this trick, we have to be based in software. Our programming cannot be written in our genes in the way it is for so many other species, because individuals have to be able to pick up their specialist tradition, and it has to function on our generalist platform. So the key to what human beings are, and the central point of our book, is that we are a species that bootstraps our own program and can therefore change it on an as-needed basis, which is what we have done throughout history and indeed prehistory.
One of the most amazing things about being moderns is, in fact, the ability to go places where a single individual human would never have been able to go before. To travel, to contract time and space, really, and to fly into places that we could only have imagined before and maybe didn't even have the capacity to imagine in times before that. And that is a true gift, and it allows us to do things like be more expansive and giving and lose our bigotry and all of these things that really are the hallmarks of humans, at least for a couple thousand years when we're at our best. But because the rate of change is changing itself so rapidly, we take these things for granted. And so we are by no means suggesting you therefore should not put yourself in a position where you're not a local and where you don't have local knowledge, but rather that you should recognize that when you do go into a new place, you aren't yet local. You don't yet have the knowledge. The people who've been there for longer than you do know more. And it would behoove all of us to recognize what gifts we've been given by modernity and which ones come with trade-offs that we can't yet perceive.
And on the heels of talking sort of about our history around the campfire, gathering around and talking, you talk about, hey, it doesn't matter how smart an individual is, doesn't matter how much they know, because in every case, when our minds come together, the whole is greater than the sum. And I think we're probably a long way off from joining minds in this way. Let's touch on that a little bit, maybe how we've gotten away from it.
Sure. Well, one thing that's true is as our networks have grown, and indeed all of us are now connected rather directly to millions of other people, the tool with which human beings pool their understanding has gotten quite blunt. So if you were to live in almost any ancestral context where the people around you were people that you had known your entire life, that you had been interacting with, whose blind spots you probably had a pretty good intuition about, whose strengths you knew well, when you spoke, they would know what you were saying and you would know what they were saying at a high level of precision. When we speak, we are in fact borrowing a tool that we have inherited from some common ancestor that none of us know. And that tool is composed of words that we only approximately understand. So in order to get to a higher level understanding, in order to get to a really productive campfire conversation, the kind that can produce new insights and new software, we have to effectively learn each other's dialect. We have to become adept at understanding exactly what's being said so that when somebody proposes an idea, it doesn't end up in our minds in a vague fashion. It ends up there in a precise fashion that we can then build on it.
Part of the way to do that is to expand and hone our theory of mind. We talk in the book about theory of mind being the ability to imagine the mental state of others, even when those others have a different mental state than your own. We talk in the book about some other species that have sort of a nascent theory of mind, baboons being one species that has been explored quite in depth. And they really do a terrific job of it, but no one comes close to us. No one comes close to humans in terms of being able to infer what someone else is thinking. And modernity, especially with the remoteness of so many of our connections through screens, through distance, even if we do have real life connections, but many of us live far away from the people with whom we feel most connected, makes it more difficult to remember theory of mind in a deep way. And that is one of the things that we need to really come together around campfire.
It is also the basis of what we were doing in our classrooms with the undergraduates that we taught, which has now become central to how we function on our podcast and is the basis of the campfire that the book is an invitation to. by listening at length, people have gained an understanding of the way we see things. And then when we try to forge our way into new territory, they have some idea what it is that's being proposed. And we hope that people who don't know us or know our style of thinking, when they pick up this book, will get a deep enough dive that they really do see through our eyes. And, we say it's an invitation to campfire because we know that it's a conversation that isn't done. It requires building from where we will have brought the reader.
Now, you guys mentioned that in the 21st century, nearly everyone accepts that evolution has created our limbs, our livers, our hearts, etc., but that many people still object when evolutionary theory is invoked to explain behavior or culture. So you talk about this in terms of the omega principle and get into it deeper here. Can we touch on that? I find this very interesting because it's a sort of different way of thinking about epigenetics than normally people in the health and paleo primal ancestral space would think of.
Sure. So let me just state the omega principle first. The omega principle is the idea that there is a specific and precise relationship between culture and other epigenetic phenomena and genes, and that once one spots that, it changes the interpretation of the interaction and indeed what it means to be human. So the relationship is that culture and other epigenetic phenomena evolve much more rapidly than genes. They are more flexible, and so they are superior in terms of their capacity to adapt. But they are inferior to genes in the sense that they are downstream, and therefore the genes have to be served by the cultural evolution, or the genes will shut down the process by which it is taking place. Now, that may sound dry and abstract, but when you spot what it implies about how we function and what the meaning of our behaviors, our intuitions, our traditions are, it's absolutely revolutionary. It fundamentally changes our understandings of ourselves, and it in fact creates not only a great deal of clarity about what we are and how we function, but it also implies things about what we should do going forward.
Let me just take a step back, because I think one of the places where people will throw an error here is saying culture and other epigenetic phenomena, right? And so we say in the book that epigenetics, which literally just means above epigenetics, genome or our genetics, used to, decades ago when we were first exposed to it in grad school in the 90s, refer to all of the things above the genome, including things like culture and behavior, which we are including in our definition here. And it's only in more recent times that we, molecular biologists and such, have come to really understand the molecular mechanisms of epigenetics, such as DNA methylation, the molecular mechanisms by which our genomes are modified. And there's a tremendous amount of power in that, and we are not discounting that power. But the idea that epigenetics has come to mean that very narrow, or to use the Latin that we use in the book, the sensu stricto definition of epigenetics, really confines our understanding of what we are evolutionarily. So we are sort of reverting to an older and broader, a sensu lato definition of epigenetics, which includes all of those things that are both above the level of the genome and also serve the genome.
Can you give sort of a quote, like real world example, or a better way for us to sink our teeth into this concept you just described?
Sure. The argument is that any adaptive phenomenon that we see in humans, which can be recognized by the fact that it is complex, expensive, and long-standing, any complex phenomenon must be serving the interests of the genes, and the interests of the genes are in finding their way into the future. So when you realize that the stuff of culture, for example, religion, music, humor, that these things, cuisine, that they meet this test, that they are adaptive, that therefore implies that their content must be getting genes lodged into the future. Now, that is very troubling for many people who have a reductionist scientific view, because they'll look into something like a religious tradition and they will say, I hear things being claimed that I know to be false, right? And it sounds like that must be some kind of a cognitive error, but it cannot possibly be a cognitive error. It would not be so widespread, and the expense of it could not be accounted for if it were an error. So the question then becomes, Why is it that people who believe things that we can demonstrate are incorrect actually outcompete people who are focused on only that which is correct? Right? That's a transformative concept. The idea that we must account for religious belief in the same way that we must account for a wing or a leaf or an eye.
Similarly, somewhat related, not exactly to your question, but we as humans, as again, have some other organisms, but no one as much as we have added to the functionality of some things that are ancient, things like food and sex. Food is for nutrition. You don't eat, you die because you starve. Sex is for reproduction. You don't have sex, you don't reproduce, your lineage dies out with you. These things are true, but humans have made so much more of them. So, why do we spend so much time around food, around cuisine, around making food with one another and breaking bread together? Because this is part of what humans are gaining from food is community, is the ability to come together around not only shared value in the food that we're eating, but the community that is built with that. And similarly, sex. We don't just have sex to make babies, obviously. And there's many, many ways that we can point to the evidence of that. But it's about bonding. And so, humans have taken many ancient things that cats do, that baboons do, that all sorts of organisms do if they are going to make it into the future. They need to eat, they need to have sex, and we have transformed them into more than they were before.
Yet not only have we transformed them, but they have been transformed in humanity by evolutionary forces that we only now begin to understand. So when Heather says that we have sex for reasons that are not just reproductive, this is a unique feature of humans that has roots inside of cultural traditions. The traditions surrounding courting, etc., are involved in the control of reproduction, but it also has physiological implications. So the fact is, in human beings, uniquely, humans are unaware of when it is they are fertile. They have sex outside of periods of fertility. We have menopause, which is extremely rare in nature, and sex continues after menopause. These are all indications that evolution itself has repurposed sex. It hasn't removed the reproductive process, but it has made it one part of something much more complex. As Heather says, it's a team building exercise, and we need to be careful with it, because as we disrupt, as we take over control, we in fact risk messing up the delicate process of team building that is at its core.
I definitely, yeah. And your part on sex and gender and all of that is really amazing. And I definitely want to touch on that. Skipping to that part briefly, you talk about, right, the benefits of sexual reproduction, why we do this. And one of the things you say is that, porn produces what you call sexual autism. Now, you're not ripping on people with autism, but can you explain that? Because you jumped in on the sex thing. Let's get right to that. That was one of my questions. I thought that was a very interesting portrayal of how you described this about people who learn sexual behavior via porn.
Yeah, we went and looked at what the clinical definition of autism is, in which people end up engaging in repetitive behaviors that often are not responsive to feedback from the environment. And from there, we use autism as a metaphor and say, well, what might produce a kind of sexual autism in which you engaged in repetitive behaviors and were not responsive to the person with whom you were engaging? Well, porn would, because if you are learning about sexuality from things that cannot respond to you by watching videos over and over again, to some degree looking at pictures, but really videos are going to be far worse, you will learn that there is a narrow suite of behaviors that are acceptable. And of course, this is the opposite of what many people say about what is on offer with the internet, that you learn about all of these niche communities and about so much that's on offer. But really, you start to see the same things over and over again, and that's what you think you do. And more to the point, you never have a chance to interact with the other person in porn. And therefore, at the point that you do, finally have a partner in real life with you, how will you know how to read his or her signals? What is it that you will have learned from porn that will teach you that the arching of the back or a gesture or a word or a sound means something? You won't have any way to know that, because what you've been watching is often scripted, often artificial, and actors. So, the idea that we can learn how to be at our most intimate, our most human, our most connected by watching people do things in which we can in no way interact with them, well, this is dangerous. And yes, we argue that it's going to produce a kind of sexual autism in which people who have learned about sex from porn are more likely to engage in repetitive, boring behaviors and also dangerous behaviors and not respond to their partner's cues.
If I can add two things. The problem with porn is that it's market driven. So it borrows all of this architecture that is deeply wired into us for the purpose of enriching somebody else, which will have arbitrary impacts on us. I should say, though, Heather and I, I'm sure, have a disproportionate number of people in our social group who are autistic. It's not that we don't recognize the distinct value of autistics, especially in modern times, but we need to understand that the way autism actually produces its unique value in modern times is that it produces an unusual relationship to sociality. So whether that's through hypersensitivity or insensitivity, it causes people's minds to look very different. And that difference is key to navigating a novel piece of history. The autism in sex doesn't appear to have any of this benefit or the analogy to autism within sex. It is simply a matter of people's deeply wired motivations being hijacked temporarily for economic purposes in a way that affects the way they view sex, so that they literally don't discover it in bed with somebody else with whom they are going to move through time as a partner. It becomes basically an interaction with an object that happens to be a human.
And you do mention that, you suggest avoiding sex without commitment, including sex for hire, because cheapening sex by seeking it everywhere and at all times renders it more difficult to form a stable bond with one individual, which you say is the best predictor of a relationship of equals. I love that. And I also love what you have to say about not interfering with children's development by trying to block, pause, or radically alter their development with gender. That, because a lot of times, you have like a 3-year-old boy will say to their mom, "I'm going to marry Joe." That doesn't mean the kid is identified as anything yet, right? They're just kids. They're playing, they're exploring. So if you could touch on those two things, the avoiding sex without commitment and also how we should approach children when they are exploring this realm.
Yeah, well, let me take children first. We argue in the book that most people don't seem to remember or recognize what childhood is. We have the longest childhoods on the planet, and that's not an error. That's not something that we should be trying to fix. That is, once again, evolution in action, producing babies that are completely helpless, like beyond helpless, and that remain very helpless for a fair bit of time. But as they begin to be able to do more and more things for themselves, what we should be doing is allowing them to explore fully and not do anything that will constrain their future abilities. Because yes, a 3-year-old boy may say, "I'm going to marry Joe," and this has nothing to say about his future sexual orientation. He may also declare that he's a dinosaur. He may also declare that what he really wants to wear to school is a dress. And, maybe in the modern moment that would be fine. And it maybe in some circles it wouldn't, except the problem would be if, because he decided to wear something that was gender nonconforming, he would be imagined to be gender dysphoric. The distinction being, I think the old gender roles are outdated and I don't need to conform to them. Cool. That's a hallmark of modernity that I feel like all of us should, and most of us do get behind. Whereas gender dysphoria, which is a very real but extraordinarily rare condition in which something about your development caused the aspects of your actual genetic sex to be out of alignment with what your brain is telling you about how you feel, that is something that is so rare that the idea that a child exploring their identity should be allowed to make decisions that constrain their future selves and will have health and fertility effects forever is a woeful mistake. Children play with who they are all the time because that's what childhood is. That's what we're trying to do in childhood.
Yeah, not only is it what we do, but it's how we discover where there is something of value that we might augment for our adulthood. I mean, the purpose of childhood is to create highly functional adults. And when we, rebuild the world around a child because they have expressed the idea that, they might marry Joe, we are doing them a terrible disservice. Now, obviously, some people do actually turn out to be gender dysphoric, but you don't know that. You can't know that so early. And we really need to do well by children by not taking them too seriously as they are discovering what they are. If we can go back to the question you asked about commitment and sex, though, the fact is we are caught in a bad bind. Modernity, especially birth control, has done tremendous good for humanity, but it has also removed the coherence from the sexual landscape. And the fact is, sex is, for males, evolutionarily speaking, almost always a win, right? The reason it's almost always a win is because males attempting to get their genes into the future, whether that's what they understand themselves to be doing or not, simply need to have sex with a fertile female and be lucky enough to fertilize an egg. And in fact, the best deal for them is if they are not required to invest in the offspring going forward. Even though that's bad for the offspring, it's evolutionarily a bargain. So men who find a landscape full of sexual opportunity are very hard to pin down with respect to commitment. On the other hand, though, most reproduction that actually works for humans is in the context of a committed relationship. Certainly, children are better off when they have at the very least two committed parents. Better than that would be an extended family and a community that were committed to the job. But a pair of parents, given how expensive it is in terms of time and investment of resources to raise a human child, having that team is really the key to having a good shot at success as an adult. So the point is, sex with commitment is the rarefied, high-quality version. Sex without commitment is very hard, especially for males, to ignore as an opportunity. And by restricting ourselves to only having sex with people who we think we might have a future with, and that doesn't mean people that you're going to marry. It means people that you don't know for sure are just about tonight. By doing that, what we do is we augment the part of the process that is about partnership and team building, and sideline the part that is about sticking somebody else with a child that they will have to raise.
And that, just to cap that off, that last bit that Bret just said is actually the advice that we've given. We have two teenage boys, and we've said to them, we expect that you will have relationships, that you will not just have one, and find the one person first, and that's who you'll be with forever and ever. But why pursue someone for the moment or for the week or whatever, with whom you already know you have no chance of any future? Why not spend your time and have your fantasies and spend your courtship and engage in thinking about someone who is of enough interest to you that you could imagine possibly ending up with her in their cases, even if you feel like you're way too young to be thinking about anything like a long-term future. Just, don't pursue someone just because she's right in front of you. If there's something about her that makes you realize, actually, I could never, ever end up, imagining bringing her home to my parents or starting a family with her.
And I think it is also, again, this is a very nice way of viewing things culturally, but this goes right down to the physiological as well. The point is these two things travel in concert. And the problem is that if we have a landscape in which people are free to do whatever and the stakes have been lowered on sex, so everybody treats it as just, another thing that happens rather than something important and special, then there's an inevitable train wreck. The inevitable train wreck comes from the fact that men are wired not to fall in love with people who go to bed with them right away, because those people don't tend to be the kinds of people who can partner in the long term. And women are wired to fall in love with people they have sex with. And so if the idea is you're a prude if you don't go to bed on the first date, then the point is that is going to cause a woman to feel jilted, and it is going to cause a man to feel like looking elsewhere, right? So if you desire the stuff in life that maybe other people's values differ, but that we claim is the best stuff, the stuff that comes from long-term commitment and partnership, then it is in your interest to delay. And in that delay, you will find a different realm.
I love in this book, I wish I could have a 10-hour interview because that was what it would take for me to cover all the things I'm interested in. You give an amazing, brief but in-depth history of human lineage and really some evolutionary gems in here, and talking about different cultures and comparing things so that, us reading it, we go, okay, that's interesting. And one of the things I found fascinating was really the discussion of reductionism in medicine and sort of the perils with that. You talked about fluoride, and then you had that interesting discussion about lactose. I'm not sure which one to go with, but you had a laryngitis story, Heather, where, they kept trying to say, take the meds, and they weren't looking at anything else. And, I think that I've been a victim of this myself. My first book is a bestseller because there are 99% of the doctors out there are uninformed about thyroid health. It's not that the information isn't there. It's not that they can't find it. It's that they're steeped in outdated protocols of something they were taught 30 years ago in medical school, and thereby also have an ego about how could I have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, gone to Yale Medical School, and not learned everything I needed to know, versus the functional medicine doctors out there, in my opinion, which are sort of better than most, in that they keep on learning, they continue to geek out. When someone comes to them with a problem that seems like, well, nope, doesn't say it with the way I was taught, they look further. Those are the kind of doctors we need. So let's talk about reductionism in medicine and these perils and some of the things you have to say about that.
Yeah, well, I agree with everything you just said. And, what we want in our doctors are people who remain inquisitive and curious and are interested in diagnosis rather than treating symptoms, and recognize that actually the patient knows a lot more about what they're experiencing than the doctor does. Yeah. And that although there are certainly true categories of disease and conditions that are out there, those diseases and those conditions manifest somewhat differently in everyone. And, it's only in the last, I don't even know, 30, 40 years that there's become a widespread understanding that even the biggest diseases manifest differently in the most obvious category difference, which is men and women. So, the idea that heart disease, the heart attack will manifest differently in men and women on average wasn't even understood 50 years ago. That tells us how new we are to thinking evolutionarily about our medical practice.
So in some ways, this is the result of a misunderstanding of the way science functions, right? We have increasingly, and this pattern has accelerated, we have removed the scientific expectation from medicine, and we have turned doctors into plumbers or something like this, where they used to have many fewer tools, but the expectation was that they would come to understand patterns through a scientific process. And what's really happened is our scientific way of thinking has been overly focused on the places in science where we have succeeded early. And those places are on the fundamental end of the continuum. So physics and chemistry, you have to get to pretty exotic phenomena before you get to things we really don't understand yet. This is not the case in biology and therefore in medicine. We are still very early in the process of understanding biology and understanding human physiology. And, if you talk to your doctor, you don't generally hear about how much we don't know. And in fact, unless your doctor is very good, there is an assumption that that if something is unknown, that there is nothing to know. So, for example, doctors willingly prescribe drugs and they don't say, actually, there's no way we could possibly know the full spectrum of effects that might come out of this, but we have reason to think that the cost-benefit analysis is favorable. That's true for almost anything that they could prescribe or almost anything you could buy over the counter. And we've seen again and again drugs that we were told were safe, like Benadryl and Tylenol and ibuprofen. All of these things were things that were presented to us as safe. And then as a larger group of people was exposed to them, it became apparent that there were actually hazards to all of them.
Part of the problem is that we're victims of our own success, and the success being exactly as we've just been talking about. The successes tend to be in the reductionist realms because those are the things that we can find and count and quantify and synthesize and hand off to people, right? The pills, those tend to be the tools that we have. And we also, with our ability to look at finer and finer spatial scales, have become, specialists. Just as you were talking, Bret, I was thinking, in 100 years ago, how many medical specialties were there? And now, putting aside the different traditions of, for instance, MDs versus DOs versus naturopaths, right? But within the Western medical tradition of MDs, you have not just surgeons and endocrinologists, but ear, nose, and throat specialists, and podiatrists, and cardiologists, and I could go on and on and on, right? And that doesn't, me pointing that out does not mean that there aren't particular things that a specialist on the heart won't be able to do that someone who is a generalist could. But what we need, and this is maybe a theme throughout the entire book, is the specialists are necessary. But what has happened is that the specialists have become the people to whom we go for all questions. And we need many more generalists, many more people who can cross domains, many more people who can do diagnosis and who understand that we are evolved beings. And what we don't get any of that kind of thinking when the first thing that happens is, oh, you've got a problem with this part of your body or this system in your body. Let me send you to the specialist who has only thought about that part or that system for their entire career.
Right. And, we, again, back to the thyroid thing, we see this, what's really missing with the conventional doctors and endocrinologists, unfortunately, tend to be the most indoctrinated. And, they're so highly specialized, they will get offended if another doctor asks for more tests because they think, well, I'm the specialist. Who are you? And you're like going, hey, where's the patient? Where's the practice of medicine here? But with at least thyroid, what they do forget is sort of this, we kind of can't escape, at least with the feedback loop with the thyroid. And I'm sure there's other systems here that you've mentioned in your book and know about, where there is a primal perspective almost to what's going on with this feedback loop. So you can give someone a thyroid hormone pill, but will it get to where it needs to go and metabolize properly without these other signals that aren't medical or aren't even food? They could be movement, lack of stress. So like just the biggest example is if someone's overworking out and under eating, trying to diet, that feedback loop in the thyroid is going to go, whoa, whoa, whoa. She doesn't have enough food right now. We can't get her pregnant, which is why infertility and miscarriages are so common with thyroid. And furthermore, we're not going to have her burn any more fat. We're going to dial back this T3 because it looks like she might be in danger, aka running or whatever the over-exercising is. So we kind of can't escape this. We have to have them meet. And maybe the functional medicine doctors or those kind of practitioners are sort of specialist generalists, I guess, would you say?
Yeah.
Well, we have a phrase that we use. It's shorthand for this on our podcast. We say, welcome to complex systems, where
Right.
you've concentrated on some known consequence of, let's say, some molecule that you take as a pharmaceutical, and then it has a spectrum of results that you couldn't have predicted because we just simply don't know enough about the system. And this is a chronic problem for us. And it's also a chronic problem that runs into an amplifier in modern times because our lives are so complex. They're novelly complex. So if you think about our diets, for example, as compared to an ancestral diet that would have been taken from the land immediately around via whatever techniques for preserving food could have been brought to bear, that's a much narrower diet, and it allows you to observe patterns consequences. When I eat this, that thing happens. Whereas we eat from so many different cultures in any given week that there's no way to track cause and effect. And in fact, the way to figure out whether there's something in your diet that might be doing you harm, as I discovered that wheat was apparently doing me terrible harm, is to simplify your diet radically and then add things back in to see what the consequence is. It's a very unnatural behavior. You can go a whole lifetime without engaging that experiment and discovering that, in fact, each and every week you're harming yourself by ingesting some molecule your body doesn't tolerate.
I found, and if you don't mind, I'd love you to relay it, because I think the whole topic of like lactose intolerance, or what people think of it, what they know of it, what are the origins, and why this would or wouldn't affect someone from a certain culture. Can you sort of describe that to our audience? Because I found that very interesting, and also I think relevant, because, it's sort of on, lactose-free milk cartons and all this type of stuff.
Yeah. Well, we argue in the book, and we're not the first to do so, that lactose intolerance should be called, among the opposite people, lactase persistence, because it's those of us who, to whatever degree, and for most of us, it's not perfect, even if we do continue to have lactase, the enzyme that allows us to break down lactose, we are the rare ones. It is, in fact, the intolerance of lactose in adults that is common, much more common in humans, and of course is the rule in all other mammals. So what is it in various human cultures that has allowed for the enzyme lactase that breaks down the milk sugar lactose to persist into adulthood, and thus allows us to do things like put cream in our coffee and eat yogurt and cheese and such? Well, there's dairy in cultures. So for instance, of Western Europe, there are, and Scandinavia, and then also among the Bedouin, the Saharan Bedouin have an ability to continue to digest lactose as adults. And most people who have not had exposure to dairy as adults lose it. So East Asian cultures, most South Asian cultures, Native American peoples, all of these people have lost the ability to eat lactose as adults, and
to digest lactose.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bret's trying to communicate something to me. I'm not sure what. So,
no, I think the point is we've got a complex interplay between levels. As babies, we naturally encounter the sugar lactose. We have the enzyme lactase to digest it. That is naturally turned off at weaning. And that's because it would be pointless to produce this enzyme when it has no target, which means that at the point that we hijack the baby feeding physiology of things like cattle, that we have the capacity to digest a sugar that we then encounter, which then causes selection to upregulate this enzyme that would otherwise have been downregulated in adulthood. And in cultures that didn't travel that route, we don't see this. And therefore, as a cosmopolitan culture in which we're all interacting and the supermarket is full of dairy, there's a question about how well prepared you are to digest it, and how well prepared comes in two forms. Do you have a personal developmental history that has kept lactase active and transcribed? And do you have an evolutionary history in which the people from which you come are sensitive to whether or not to upregulate that enzyme? And so what you're seeing actually in this case is a really interesting demonstration of why omega is an important principle, because you're looking at cultural traditions, the animal husbandry and the use of milk as a foodstuff that affects the physiology of the creature, which is obviously encoded genetically in the form of the enzyme to break down the sugar and how many copies of it you have, and then epigenetically whether or not it's upregulated in adulthood. So there's no way to understand that system without recognizing the underlying truth and importance of the omega principle. If the cultural aspects are really separate from the genetic aspects, then this story doesn't even make sense.
Right. I want to move on to being an adulthood. You have with each one of your sections, you have a little sort of section called the corrective lens, which ways we can think about changing ourselves or the way we're thinking about something. And you say, get over your bigotry. Variation is our strength, not just sex and race and sexual orientation, but class, neurodiversity, characteristics, and personality. And all of this adds up to what we can accomplish on Earth. So let's talk about, for the adults listening, how can we move into being more of an adult in the proper ways that are more communal?
Well, suffice it to say that we have personally encountered a wide range of people across the political spectrum. And one thing that's true is that real bigotry has actually become quite rare. Ignorance is still common across the political spectrum, but by and large, we all seem to agree on what sort of world is desirable. It's a world that isn't rigged in favor of some people and against other people. It's a world that provides opportunity and democratizes the tools with which one makes use of it. And that's a very good thing. That's an evolutionary innovation in which we have moved past the narrow focus on advancing our genes and those who carry them and moved into a more cooperative phase, which is something we should protect.
So how do we do that? We do that by reducing our ignorance, because most of the apparent bigotry that we see now today is actually not hatefulness, but ignorance. It's naivete. So we do that by traveling, by actually traveling, by going to places where people live lives that don't look like our own, and just being among them, observing, going into bars, spending time in the public square, observing, being open to interaction, regardless of how good your language is in the land in which you've landed. And when you're at home, when you aren't in the mode where you can be embracing of other and see how many different ways that humans live on the planet and how functional they all are. And every culture has something that it's doing some way that is going to be surprising to you, and probably some way that's going to be better than how it is that you do it in your home culture. Closer to home, on in things like social media, reach across the boundaries that exist. Follow accounts of people with whom you disagree, with whom you disagree. Pay attention to the things that are said by people whom you thought you agreed with, where you get a little glitch and you think, what? I didn't think they thought that. I don't think that. What did that mean? Pay attention to that. Don't immediately dismiss it. Don't pretend it didn't happen. Don't go on the offensive. Don't go on the warpath every time someone says something you disagree with or actively disagrees with you. Remember that we are not a world of superheroes and supervillains. We are all human, and we all have some strengths and some weaknesses. And on the inside, we look more similar than different. And that's true on the outside too, but that's easy to forget in the era of social media in particular.
Yeah. So I wonder what you think about the following, because I didn't see too much in depth in your book on it, although it was touched on in little different ways. So when I think about it, I'm like, if we could teach a class to a hunter-gatherer right now, right, we'd be like, oh my God, here are the warnings. We've learned so much, right? This is what we can tell you. These are all the warnings. I feel, though, that if they could look into what our lives have become, they would have some warnings too. And one of those areas that I feel this is in terms of mindset. Because back when we had these survival pressures and things like that, where we don't really have them now, it seems like, and back then, I really doubt that people wallowed in self-pity and depression when they didn't catch the beast, right? Or the water source was tainted, and maybe they got over death a little sooner. Maybe there's not someone in the hunter-gatherer area that was on their 4th year of being depressed and mourning the loss of someone. Now, I'm not bagging on anyone who's still, mourning the loss of someone 4 years later, but just this concept of the way that we look at things, our perceptions, it's almost like we have the luxury of the time to wallow in our thoughts, not just even on the good things like philosophizing and all of that, but the self-pity, they had a more forge ahead, onward and upward, buck up, that's life kind of thing. And I'm not trying to be harsh by saying that, but just curious what your thoughts are on that, because that's where I think we can learn a little bit from them. Now, granted, they might have dragged me by my hair into a cave, or that stereotypical image we might see in a cartoon. And yeah, there certainly wasn't, maybe some women's rights or some other things going on we wouldn't have complained about then. But just this basic outlook, right? This wallowing in our self-pity. We had this sort of luxury to do that now. We didn't then. What can we learn from them and maybe adopt now? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the word that you use is exactly the right one. It's a luxury, and it's not one that we should want. With it comes all sorts of benefits. We really have gained tremendously, especially in the last 100 years, especially as post-industrialists, with regard to things like women's rights and civil rights and gay rights, and all of these things. And it really is the best of times. It's also the worst of times, as I think we begin the book with the Dickens quotation, exactly that. In what ways is it the worst of times? Partially exactly as for the reasons you say, that we have the luxury of having had so many of our actual necessities taken care of by the conveniences, that we have been freed up to wallow, to spend time worrying. And unfortunately, what is also true, and this is often missed, I think, in such discussions, is so much of the physical labor that our ancestors would have engaged in has been replaced by mindless, menial, logistical, so-called mental labor, like spending time on phone trees trying to get to customer service and figuring out if the 3 things on your credit card bill that look alike are really the same thing and need to be fixed. These sorts of just agonizing, grueling, no reward work that so many of us spend way too much time at. Compared to that work, I would rather be washing my clothes in the stream, frankly. And, I say that a little bit facetiously, but also because of the field work I've done in the past. I've been in places where I've washed my clothes in the stream and was very far away from the internet. And you wake up in those situations knowing what needs to be done with the day and knowing when you've done it, and knowing then when you are free to spend the rest of your time thinking deep thoughts or creating or discovering or exploring or whatever it is that your particular brain is best suited to. So I would say that one of the cures for this set of modern woes is to engage the physical world. Which will remind you that many of the things that we find to be our woes and the things that we wallow in are actually not only helped, but put in perspective by engagement with physical landscapes and activities.
So I would add, I resonate strongly with the point that you make, but I think we can say it maybe more concisely, that any ancestor who lived in an environment for which they had been tuned, for which the adaptive process, both cultural and genetic, had tuned them, would not end up endlessly wallowing. What they would do is they would dwell exactly the right amount, right? They do feel frustration when they fail to hunt the kudu successfully, but they experience exactly the right amount. And the right amount means they derive the correct lesson from the failure, and beyond that, they move on to the next hunt, right? Why is that? Because anyone who wastes time dwelling on things for which there's no positive output is outcompeted by someone who wastes the right amount of time or spends the right amount of time on those ideas. And I think it is also
right. It would have been a sure recipe for death for them,
right,
in a lot of ways, right? So they wouldn't have even engaged in it for too long.
Right. Any extra time you spend dwelling on the loss of the kudu is time you have not spent tracking the next one. So you would find this process extremely well tuned to the environment. And I would just point out that we disrupt this process arbitrarily without even realizing that we are interfering with it. And so one place, for example, we moderns, yes, we interfere with this all the time, and our intuitions about how much to concern ourselves with a particular thing or not, we fail to concern ourselves when we should, right? When we have a close call with death and we look at it and we say, well, I came away without a scratch, and we move on. We don't actually correct our thinking and say, actually, the thing that saved me here was luck. That should never be the case. What did I do wrong? Where was my error? That would be a much healthier thing to do. But I just want to point out.
And lastly, I just want to highlight that because and Art Devaney talks about that, but to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, failure was feedback, right? So again, they might have had a hit and been a little bit bummed, but it was feedback.
Absolutely. Exactly. And what Heather and I try to call people's attention to is that in a world where rewards and penalties are all coming through the social channel, where they have to do with whether or not your boss is pleased with your work or frustrated, you don't build a high quality model of how the world actually works. You build a model of what the social world thinks, and that is not healthy. So children having wrong ideas about what they can do and it resulting in them falling off their bicycles and scraping themselves up or even breaking something do learn about the world. And this is a process that we do away with at our peril and very much to their peril.
Yeah, early failure leads to later success. And so, constraining people from experiencing failure, especially young people, will create fragile, naive waifs who can't navigate the world.
Right. It's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. Development should be anti-fragile.
I wish I had more time with you because there's so much to get into. This is such a juicy, wonderful book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. You also have a podcast, Dark Horse Podcast. So I'm a fan. So many other people are as well. It's a wonderful show. We'll put everything to connect with you in the show notes. What would you like to leave our audience with? Obviously, we couldn't get to every part and every aspect of this book, but anything else you'd like to leave our audience with on this topic before we go?
Yeah, I think the key thing, one can look into this book and see a long list of problems that we face, and they can feel daunted by it. But the full message of the book is that we are a species uniquely positioned to deal with novelty. And although we have created a level of novelty that is challenging our adaptive capacity in modern times, we are also a species that is capable of recognizing that that's what we're doing, reining in the process, and figuring out how to live in a world that, yes, we will create, with which we can be in harmony.
Yeah, I would just add, just because something is evolutionary doesn't mean that it's unchangeable. We have been handed a tremendous amount of value and also of costs from our evolutionary past. And the better we understand what that past is and what our present situation is with regard to our evolved selves, the better we can understand ourselves, avoid those things that evolution has handed us that are less good or interesting for us going forward, and create a future that is the best for everyone.
I love it. Yes. And I felt very inspired by it. I thought the scales tipped more in that favor after reading about it. And also, again, like I said at the beginning, truly I didn't think I could have a more in-depth appreciation and understanding of being a human, especially with all the ancestral digging I've done before, but this really does it. And I love it. Thank you so much for joining us. And for everyone else, we'll see you soon.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Hey listeners, over the years, a ton of companies have approached me to collaborate, but I will only promote companies whose products I believe in and that I actually use and consume on a regular basis. So let me tell you about some of my favorite companies that I can offer you discounts for. Rep Provisions, an amazing company doing incredible things for our planet, topsoil, and animals with regenerative agriculture, and it's my #1 source for quality pasture-raised meat and chicken. Visit repprovisions.com and use code L15 for 15% off. I'm also obsessed with a company called Carnivore Crisps. They make a lean, all-natural, and delicious alternative to conventional snacking, made with just real meat and real salt. Totally addictive, and my favorite ones are the beef brisket and the ribeye. Visit carnivorecrisps.com and use code PALEO10 for 10% off. I also love and regularly use Paleo Valley products. They make amazing supplements and delicious paleo products. I use the superfood greens powder, grass-fed beef sticks, the organ complex, and their bone broth bars. I love the lemon and apple. I also use their essential C complex and more. Visit paleovalley.com/promos/Elle Russ for 15% off. I also love Primal Kitchen. They make delicious paleo-approved, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and no refined sugar products, and I use them daily, from their collagen powders and sauces and marinades to their avocado and olive oil. So good, so healthy. Visit primalkitchen.com and use code L10 for 10% off. I also love paleo powder and use it almost on everything I cook. They make incredible seasoning blends, and they also have these incredible grain-free coatings that feel just like crispy breadings that you would have had prior to knowing that there's another way. So visit paleopowder.com and use code L15 for 15% off.